So, good afternoon. I'm Kate Pritchard, part of the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. Today is Thursday, January 19th, 2023, and I'm pleased to welcome you and our speakers to our webinar today. The webinar is titled MOUs for Collaborating Institutions, New Template from the Federal Demonstration Partnership, otherwise known as FDP. There are a few housekeeping details. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please try and enter them in the Q&A box. If a question is a little bit more nuanced or context specific, we'll forward the question to our speakers after the webinar, and then we'll append the answers to the transcript. We'll also be monitoring the chat the best that we can, and we encourage you to use it to interact with us and our other participants. So with that, let's get started with introductions for our speakers. Dr. Axel Wolff currently serves as the Deputy Director at OLAW and previously served as the Director of the Division of Compliance Oversight and as the Senior Assurance Officer. Prior to joining OLAW, Dr. Wolff was the Director of the Veterinary Resources Program in the National Institutes of Health's Intramural Biomedical Research Support Program. His interest in unique research animals has involved him in work with armadillos, chimpanzees, and fruit bats, as well as more common species. Amanda R. Humphrey is the Chief Research Operations Officer for Northeastern University across the campus network. Amanda oversees the efficiency of research operations and contributes to compliance objectives for the university. Externally, she contributes to various professional associations, including as a member of the National Council of University Research Administrators Select Committee on Global Affairs and various initiatives to reduce administrative burden for institutions and faculty nationwide through the Federal Demonstration Partnership. Amanda is passionate about advocating for thorough and thoughtful compliance measures across the research enterprise. Amanda has degrees from Smith College and University College London and recently received her MBA from Northeastern University. And although he was unable to join us today, we'd also like to acknowledge the important contributions of Ara Tamayasin, PhD, to the FDP MOU Template effort. Dr. Tamayasin is the Chief Research Compliance Officer at Harvard University and serves as the Director of the broader Middle East North African Bioethics Forum. And with that, I'll hand it over to our first speaker, Dr. Axel Wolff.
Thank you, Dr. Pritchard, and hello, everybody. This is what we will cover today. First, what is the Federal Demonstration Partnership, or FDP? This is being addressed because it is the entity in which the template form was developed. We'll also go over OLAW's regulatory or oversight context, why FDP created these templates, the memorandum of understanding, the user manual overview, and then we'll answer some questions. So let's get started. What is the Federal Demonstration Partnership? The FDP mission states that it's an association of federal agencies, academic and nonprofit research institutions, and research policy organizations that work together to streamline the administration of federally sponsored research and foster collaboration to enhance the national research enterprise while maintaining high standards of stewardship and accountability. So in a nutshell, it focuses on researchers doing research rather than administration. The FDP is a long-standing partnership between federal funding agencies and research institutions that works to reduce administrative burden associated with research grants and contracts. Currently, there are 10 federal agency members and more than 200 research institutions. It was a program that was originally convened by the Government University Industry Research Roundtable of the National Academy. It's a unique forum for individuals from universities and nonprofits to work collaboratively with federal agency officials to improve the national research enterprise. So what is OLAW's jurisdictional oversight? OLAW oversees the Public Health Service funded animal activities. The Public Health Service agencies involved in funding are the National Institutes of Health, which is the primary one, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Food and Drug Administration, and also the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. Through a memorandum of understanding, OLAW's authorities have expanded and now cover also the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, the National Science Foundation, NSF, and Department of Veterans Affairs, or VA. Ground rules for institutions. For projects that are subject to the PHS policy or those of the other agencies that I mentioned, these entities are required to use the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals as a basis for developing and implementing an institutional program for activities involving animals. All performance sites must also be covered by an assurance, which OLAW issues. Collaborative agreements serve to ensure that the requirements of the PHS policy are met at all performance sites, and therefore it assists in preventing reportable noncompliances. Next. So the guide states that these collaborations, interinstitutional collaborations, have the potential to create ambiguities. In cases of animal use collaboration beyond just animal transport, the participating institutions should have a formal written understanding that addresses the responsibility for off-site animal care and use, animal ownership, and IACUC review and oversight. IACUCs from participating institutions may choose to review protocols. The participating institutions should have a formal written understanding, such as a contract, memorandum of understanding, or agreement. The guide offers flexibility in development, provided the outcomes listed on the previous slide are met. So OLAW's oversight or regulatory context, we will, when we, for instance, visit institutions, we'll check on the MOUs that are in place or the equivalent document that are being used when collaborations are in place. And these should address how the oversight and care of the vertebrate animals will be handled. Support does not always mean money. Support can mean, for instance, unfunded collaboration, such as providing expertise or contributing or interpreting data sets. I will now turn the microphone over to my colleague, Amanda Humphrey, and she will continue. Amanda?
Thank you, Axel. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why did FDP even dive into this space? You know, most of the people that participate in FDP are not those in the office of the IACUC at an academic institution or medical center. So why did we even come to this? So we created these tools because we were observing a number of areas of administrative burden that were surfacing. We noticed that there was variable interpretation of the requirements of the guide, which was creating variable business processes or operational gaps. And, you know, every institution strives to ensure the best possible care for animals, and that is really paramount. And so what we did is we considered a number of different documents, vehicles, ways of clarifying the obligations set forth in the guide, as Axel set forth for everyone here earlier. And we ultimately discussed an MOU as the most appropriate type of agreement, because there's really we often issue subawards between collaborating institutions. And while that document is a really wonderful mechanism for conveying information between two institutions, we heard from a lot of our members that the office of the IACUC and oftentimes the sponsored programs office, you really weren't in the same work stream. They didn't have access to each other's systems. They weren't really clear on how to get that information from one side to the other so that the information was flowing correctly as required by the guide related to the information contained in an MOU. And so what we wanted to do was create an MOU sample that could be used in the cases where institutions did not have that nice ability to have work streaming between a sponsored programs office that might be executing contracts and an office of the IACUC that would actually be overseeing the care and welfare of vertebrate animals. And so we wanted to have a sample that would address that, and also just something that we were sure would not have conflicting terms between the standard FDP subaward template that we use all the time between academic institutions and this MOU document. So that was also part of our remit as we looked at this process. And then we also wanted to think about ways to help reduce the burden around review and signature time, and creating samples that institutions can go and say, oh, this is a pretty good basic sample. We're going to use this sample and we're going to give this sample to other institutions. Makes it a lot easier, because then when you receive that sample and it's not been altered, and the review and signature process is much more streamlined. And then, one of the key reasons that we dove into this in the first place is that we wanted to make sure that the reporting practices across institutions were clear and consistent. And so we wanted to make sure that institutions knew who was going to do the reporting, because there are, we didn't want institutions in some cases to be both notifying OLAW that there had been an event at one institution and maybe double reporting something. And at the same time, we also didn't want neither institution to report something because they didn't know who should be doing the reporting. So we wanted to make some of those understandings explicit between the parties. Also, just things like whether or not the collaborating institution should be notified if there is a notification forwarded to OLAW. That's something that was a very variable practice, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we did is we started thinking about an MOU, and we created a working group to develop a generic MOU template or sample that would be applicable across collaborating institutions that were using vertebrate animals. We wanted to use this MOU to reduce burden and also provide enough flexibility that everyone has that institution or two institutions where you do a lot of volume with that organization. So as we'll talk about later, there are ways to modify the MOU sample so that you can use it more broadly across your institution with another institution if that makes more sense for you. But you can also use it for a one-off situation with an institution you maybe don't collaborate with that frequently. And of course, we wanted to create something that institutions have the opportunity to learn from, but not necessarily to implement at their home institution. We do have some institutions through FDP that use the subaward, and they have language in there that covers the obligations of the MOU as outlined by Axel earlier and kind of articulated within the guide. And we didn't want to prevent institutions from doing that, but we wanted to provide some real clarity around what should be covered in an MOU so that if an institution does want to go down that road, they know what that looks like. And really, we wanted to focus in on preventing problems and misunderstandings which could negatively impact the care of a vertebrate animal. And we just want to really emphasize and underline here that the MOU template or sample that we have generated is not required by OLAW. It is just one tool of many that institutions have at their disposal to help them navigate these collaborations, interinstitutional collaborations. Next slide, please. So when we designed the tools, we designed actually two tools, which we will walk through today. One is the MOU sample, and the other part is a user manual, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. Here were some of the things that we wanted to answer, some of the questions that we wanted to answer. We wanted to make sure that we were providing pathways for institutions to define roles and responsibilities clearly, whether the work is funded or unfunded by NIH. And then, how do we do that in a really clear, easy, concise document that doesn't have a lot of legalese in it and makes those roles and responsibilities crystal clear? And then how do we do this in a way that is not burdensome, in a way that the language is clear and easy to understand. So that's really what we went through when we went through this process. And we actually had people from the administrative side of the house, like myself. I have never been in an office of the IACUC. I've sat on our IACUC meetings at various institutions I've been at and found them deeply interesting, but I've never actually served on an IACUC or worked in an office of the IACUC. And then we also had experts from offices of the IACUC, as well as several wonderful participants from federal agencies giving us feedback and guidance, including the USDA, OLAW, and the Office of Veterans Affairs. So we really appreciated all of the hard work that went into this from a variety of stakeholders. Next slide, please. So how did this all start, and how did we decide what road we were going to start down, and how did we even narrow down some of these pathways that I've talked about of understanding the ways that institutions were interpreting the requirements or executing the requirements at their own institution? This all started with a webinar that we hosted back in 2019. During that webinar, which is available on the FDP website, and I will provide a link as well as walking you to that website when we run through the tools, we asked a couple of questions of our community, and these were ones that really helped us define our direction. So the first question we asked is, does your institution issue MOUs when multiple institutions are working with vertebrate animals on the same research project? And a slight majority, 34% said always. Even if there is a subaward, they will always issue an MOU. And then 86 respondents out of 262, or 33% of the respondents, said, I don't know what we do. And 25 respondents, or 10%, said only if there's not a subaward. And then 62 respondents, or 24%, said, we do not issue MOUs. We consider the OLAW assurance of the subrecipient collaborator to be sufficient. And I'll just briefly touch on that to say is that as of today, the FDP subaward template that is available does not specifically address reporting requirements related to OLAW. And I think that's really definitely a consideration that I wanted to highlight, because it was something that I was really not clear about when we started this whole process that we went through. So next slide, please. The next question we asked is, when you're a subrecipient on an NIH-funded project, where do you report any animal welfare issues? Do you report them directly to OLAW and not tell the pass-through entity? That may actually have impact on data quality and data integrity issues. Do you send it directly to OLAW, but also send a copy to the pass-through entity or your collaborator institution? And then, either as a CC or under separate notice. Or do you send it to the pass-through entity and have them send it to OLAW and ask them to send it forward to OLAW? Or do you not know what the process is? And so 44% of the institution said they do send it directly to OLAW, but they also send a notification to the collaborating or pass-through entity. But 35% said that they were not sure what the process was. And part of the reason that so many of these respondents probably are not aware of what the process is probably a majority of the individuals that were on this call were from the administrative office, the Office of Sponsor Programs, and not from the Office of the IACUC. So they may not have been quite as familiar with some of the business processes that the Office of the IACUC has in place. Next slide, please. And the last question that we asked is, how is operational alignment between your institution's IACUC office when issuing MOUs and the office that issues subawards? And by that, I usually generically mean the Office of Sponsored Programs that I've been referring to as we've been talking. It can be called a lot of different things at different institutions. It might be called a research management office, et cetera. So we had 271 responses to this. All of our questions throughout the webinar were voluntary responses, so we didn't get responses from everyone every time. so only 18% of the institutions that responded to this question said that the MOU process and the subaward process are closely aligned. So there is somehow a communication between the IACUC office and the subaward office that says, hey, we have a subaward that also indicates that the subrecipient will be doing work with vertebrate animals. Office of the IACUC, are you guys going to issue an MOU? Or, are we going to incorporate this language? And that is actually 10% of the institutions that responded to this said that the MOU language is actually included in the subaward, and that just that Office of Sponsor Programs deals with all of it. But 42% of the respondents said that the MOU process and the subaward process are mutually exclusive and not tied together at all. And often we were finding the reason for that is because those offices likely have different reporting chains or lines of command. They may not have systems that talk to each other, or work streams that talk to each other in any other format. So we wanted to bridge that gap through our tools. Next slide, please. So when this initially come to us, it actually come in as a request to the subaward subcommittee, which I at the time was a co-chair of, and it was asking us just put some language into the subaward, and that way we don't have to issue separate MOUs. And what this whole webinar that we did, as well as some other feedback mechanisms that we had with recipient institutions, told us is that we were not ready to leverage the subaward as a final solution just yet, although that could be a future tool that we work toward. And putting the MOU language in there may actually inhibit some of the adoption, because an MOU is generically like a pretty informal document. It's maybe not as legally formal as a contract or agreement of another form or format. It doesn't include anything like, I represent and certify, I warrant to you, things that have legal implications. And we were pretty careful about trying to avoid such terms when we were actually drafting the MOU. And ultimately, we wanted to develop consensus among institutions, reduce confusion and burden in either issuing and or reviewing those MOUs. And one of the ways that we felt that we could do that would be by creating some tools. Next slide, please. And so what we ultimately came up with was this two-pronged approach. What we'll call today a user manual, which clarifies our interpretation of the requirements. It gives some tools and resources for getting institutional offices on the same page. We found when we started these conversations that there were terms that an office of the IACUC might use that would mean something completely different over in research administration land, and vice versa. And then also understanding institutional practices around MOUs and what might your peer institutions be doing and how might they be using MOUs and subawards. And then we also wanted to create an MOU sample to initially identify what makes the good memorandum of understanding, what needs to be in there that helps us and informs the way that we talk about things in what we'll call the user manual or the guidance. And then we wanted to have a sample product for institutions to be able to use across a variety of funding agencies, including OLAW, USDA, VA, et cetera. And as I mentioned before, we had great contributions from our colleagues at those agencies. And that really helped us to create a document that I think is more universally useful than if we had worked with one agency alone. Next slide, please. I will actually take you to the website for this in just a second, but I wanted to show you that there is a slide in the slide deck that will get you started with this. So when, if you forget what I'm showing you in the on the website in a second, when I take over screen share, at the top in the first red bounded box there, you'll kind of see a breadcrumb trail of where you need to go when you get into the FDP website. On the right-hand side, you'll see a link to the FDP website. And then down below, you'll notice a second bounded box under the resources section. These are all of the materials related to the IACUC MOU project. There's the webinar that I referenced, including the second bullet is the slides to the webinar. And then you'll notice our FDP MOU sample, as well as the MOU guidance document. And, one thing I want to make clear here is that I know that when you're in an office of the IACUC, anything that's issued by OLAW or another animal welfare regulatory agency, such as USDA, if it is called guidance, it is not guidance. It is a rule that you really need to follow. In research administrator land, everything is guidance. All best practices, all user manuals, all things that have that title or that name. We don't really make a distinction and say, oh, guidance is something that I need to pay attention to in a different way than I pay attention to perhaps a document that outlines best practices or a user manual. So I just want to make that really clear. We did change the title on the MOU guidance on our website recently to try and harmonize a little bit more so that it was more clear that this is just information that we want you to have as resources at your fingertips and not something that is mandated to follow. But it is helpful to understand if you do see some places in the document that still say guidance, that we are not trying to kind of put that on the same level playing field with guidance that you might receive from a federal agency. So I just wanted to make that clear. I'm going to take over screen share, just so you know. Okay, so I'm going to start with the FDP website, and this is the landing page of the FDP website. When you come to visit us, this is what you will see. One thing that most institutions are familiar with is our subaward forms, and you're certainly welcome to go in and click through those. But if you are looking specifically for the MOU guidance or user manual, as well as the MOU sample, where you'll want to go is actually down here under FDP committees. And then here's another wacky thing about administrators. We called the animal subject subcommittee instead of just vertebrate animal subcommittee or Office of the IACUC subcommittee, but that's what it means. And it's just our we have a lot more administrators than IACUC individuals affiliated with the FDP, and so we wanted to make we're kind of using our own parlance instead of maybe what the formal parlance is in an office of the IACUC. And here are those resources that I was talking about. And I'm just going to pretend to click on, I have these documents pulled up on my desktop already, but I am just going to kind of click on this user manual, and I'm going to start with the user manual and walk you guys through that. So this user manual has a couple of different sections, and this document, really looked at the guide. It listened to our experts in the room from the federal agencies and the various offices across the United States, including large and small animal welfare programs, as well as folks from sponsored programs offices. We always have our nice little disclaimer in here that nothing in this document is legal advice. So, if you are using this or you're relying on it or anything like that, I always recommend please make sure that you've pulled in your general counsel's office as you go to implement these documents, in addition to working between your Office of Sponsored Programs and your Office of the IACUC. So we have a section in here that just lays out some definitions. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, especially because some of them will be answered in the Q&A, or we can dive into them during that section later. But then we try and walk through, why is an MOU important? What is its purpose, and how is it different to the purpose of a subaward? Real quick, high level, the subaward is really putting it into the context of the overall collaborative project, whereas an MOU is really focused on the care of any vertebrate animals utilized in the conduct of that project. And then this again gives a few specific bullets on what is an MOU versus a subaward, and then who is required to have an MOU or agreement and who should see it. And then we get into some recommendations for planning and institutional communication regarding the MOU, just to get institutions started. If you haven't started this already at your institution, this can help be a conduit or a starting point for that. And then we go through some FAQs about what an MOU is, how to use it, and what institutions may or may not require it, and what does that mean. So those documents are there and available for your guidance. I think if you download it, it looks a little bit neater, that the headers get a little bit strange in the web view. I'm just going to pause my share and do a new share. And I'm going to actually show you the other important document. Okay, not showing. I'm going to try again. Which is the actual FDP MOU sample. And this sample, as you can see, is a Word document. I'm just going to make a couple of quick statements here about this before we dive into the actual MOU itself. Whenever FDP puts its name on something, we try and have our name means consistency, which allows institutions to reduce administrative burden. So if your institution wants to use the MOU, but you feel you need to change language within the MOU for any reason, I have no judgment about that, but please remove these 3 letters, FDP. That is a signal to other institutions that this document has been modified from its original format and terms and conditions, so that they need to read it in a different way than if it just says FDP at the top, because then, maybe it's more of a skim read or skim review. Then if you've got something, a more substantive change, we want to really dive into that and see what you've changed in the document. So we've got kind of a sets forth the purpose here, and then this applicability statement, you could change this if you're, I work and live in Boston, and so I am within arm's length of multiple other research institutions, and I can think of a couple of research hospitals where
Hi,
even
Amanda.
within, yes. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, this is Kate. We can't see your screen share. Can you try again?
Yes. Sorry about that.
No worries. Oh, that looks great. Thanks so much.
Okay. Yeah. And so here, all right, so here are those 3 little FDP words that I mentioned. Here's our kind of general opening salvo of the purpose of an MOU. And then here, this goes to the applicability. This is a great place to highlight where institutions may need to change this. If you're one of the many Boston Longwood hospitals down the street from me, you may be having animals on the same floor that actually belong to 2 different hospitals, and you might have that happening throughout. And so you want to have a kind of generic MOU that covers the relationship between the 2 institutions and not necessarily dig into protocol after protocol after protocol. If you're in that kind of situation, I would recommend that you modify this and take out the phrases protocol and maybe just reframe that how you want to document that this is really the default position for how your institutions will move forward, unless otherwise indicated by a specific MOU if you have a special situation. But if you are using this for one or a small number of projects that you're trying to document, it provides all the relevant information of institution A and institution B. We've tried to define, who should be institution A and who should be institution B. In sponsored program research administration world, typically institution A would be what we call the pass-through entity. This is the institution that's typically receiving the bucket of federal funding and is then passing it to institution B, maybe through a subaward, or maybe there isn't a subaward, but they're kind of the programmatic lead of the project, and they are working with institution B, who's feeding information to them that will then, kind of roll up into the final deliverables, the final report that is going back to that funding agency. And so institution B, sometimes called the subrecipient, receiving institution, et cetera, fills that role of rolling that information back up to the other institution. And we provide some basic demographic information here, as well as some project or specific information that you can either fill out, just in line here by removing this text and typing in, or like we indicate, providing a table if there's, more than one protocol covered there. And we provide all the regulatory references for everything that we talk about. These were the documents that we really used when we were going through everything. And then I'll have you notice that this is only 3 pages long. And the first page, there's not a lot of information that you've got to do. There's not a lot of terms and conditions. And the same is true throughout this document. Even, the last page, you'll notice half of it is a signature block, which is pretty great. So this is not a legalese heavy document that institutions have to go through. We started by breaking this down into components such as what is it that you're really going to want to understand about your collaborator when you're entering into an MOU? So we just have some generic program-wide acknowledgements, information about whether or not transportation needs to be covered either in this or a separate document, and then information about ownership and oversight of the animals. Being in Boston, I can say that you might have animals that are owned by Hospital A, but are being housed at Hospital B, but they ultimately are still owned by Hospital A. And so you might have some interesting permutations on the theme, but I think for most institutions, the default is going to be if it's happening on your campus or your institution, that those animals are typically owned by you. And then investigation and reporting, just covering some of those really important areas that really assure that animals are being properly cared for in the conduct of research. We also have a very broad category for other requirements not addressed above. So if there are any special situations that you encounter, this is a great place to add those. We know that sometimes there are state-specific laws that are different, and you can document those there. So I wanted to just bring back, so how do you fill this out if you're an institution? We try and just give some instructions here in this top part. So if you're filling this out, you would probably want both institutions to fill out this program-wide acknowledgement. So you'd put an X or check mark or whatever you wanted A to indicate your concurrence with that. If maybe institution A does not have any information to share, maybe they're not doing the animal work, they might click NA, but institution B might click yes. So you just go through this, and in instances where we think that in most cases it's either an A or a B, we will actually indicate this in the instructions, like choose one, and that we find is pretty helpful. So we try and be pretty prescriptive about when would you want to have that latitude or that flexibility to select yes or not applicable for each of those institutions, and when would you really want to be prescriptive. And I just want to draw attention to the language here, because I talked a little bit earlier about the fact that we don't have a lot of legalese in this agreement. We don't ask institutions to represent, certify, warrant. We didn't want to get into that because some institutions are comfortable with this, some institutions are comfortable with that. At the end of the day, this is, a lot of that type of language is covered typically under a subaward agreement or subaward situation. So we wanted to focus on just the parties documenting understandings in this document. And so that's where we have the parties acknowledge, the parties agree, the parties acknowledge, and it's really just about that formalizing and documenting for the institution. And then there is some USDA, in keeping with the fact that we do have some USDA input here, we do reference some USDA things within this document. So, and you may want to add, if you're working with another, we've got a USDA annual report here that may only be relevant in some situations or some cases. So you just look at your specific use case and see if it's relevant to you. And if you don't find it, that's what the other requirements not addressed above is. And then we try and make it really clear who are the people that your institution might have as the appropriate signatory for this. There could be a range of individuals, and we've tried to list them out there so that, if this does get somehow to the hands of a faculty member before it gets to the office of the IACUC or the attending veterinarian or an IACUC administrator, that it's really clear where does it need to go so that it gets to the right place and that chain of command is followed. And I think that is everything that I had to share about those. Axel, did I miss anything that you wanted me to go back through?
Oh, we have time. Why don't you just walk through it a little more and just show
Sure.
what some of these examples are, because I think we still have time here to do that.
Okay, so I'll give an example that I have come across, and this is a pretty rare example, but let's just say Institution A has a grant from the NIH, and they are not conducting vertebrate animal studies or work at Institution A. They have no subrecipients on the project, but there is an Institution B that is conducting vertebrate animal work under maybe another funding source, and then actually providing that data over to Institution A for use in the grant funded by the NIH. That is a perfect situation where you will not have a subaward to document your understandings, and where an MOU can be particularly useful. So if we're thinking about that, let's just say these two institutions do not work together very frequently. If I'm pretending that I work at Institution A, I would fill this information out on behalf of my known faculty member and document, what grant does this tie to? And then if I'm sending this over to Institution B and asking them to document their understandings with me, this is where I'll put their relevant information related to the project as far as I know or understand it. In some cases, I might have to ask them to fill in specific things, like maybe their protocol approval dates or their protocol numbers if I'm not aware of those when I send this over. And I might not even have a protocol approval date and a protocol title, because there may not be a congruency review at my institution if the vertebrate animal work is not being conducted at my institution. And so this would be a place where, hopefully a faculty member is asking those questions and saying, hey, do I need a congruency review? And we would probably say, yes, you should just go through one. It's a really, if nothing else, we want to know that vertebrate animal work is related to this project and that something is happening so that we can make sure that we have the right understandings in place. And so you come down here still with that understanding, and we know that Institution A is not going to be doing any vertebrate animal work, but they still have a program of animal care and use qualified to perform animal care and use activities. And the other institution may still be interested in knowing that about the other institution. So maybe both institutions say yes, because this is a pretty generic, we're not asking anything specific about this project or this collaboration. So we both might say yes to that. And, we both still might choose to say yes to this first understanding here. Might want to make that more consistent over on that side, make that bold too. But at the end of the day, both institutions are checking yes under that program-wide acknowledgement. Based on the information I've already provided about the context here, it's unlikely that animals will be transported from point A to point B. But, this does say as applicable, but you could say, hey, it's not applicable in this case. So we're both going to check NA, because no animals are going to be transported during the course of this project. So we don't need to worry about that. Ownership and oversight, if Institution A is not seeing these animals and all of the work being done with them is totally being done over at Institution B, pretty good chance that those animals are going to be owned by as well as overseen by Institution B. So we'll assume that that is the case, and we would click yes for Institution B, but not applicable for Institution A. And then, the parties acknowledge, well, since we don't have any animals in our possession related to this project over at Institution A, we might click not applicable. And over here on B, we will click yes, because they are really going to be ensuring this. And then how are we going to review and approve prior to the initiation of the activities? And this, might be a congruency review, or it might be a full protocol approval. Institution B is definitely going to have that. This might vary depending on what Institution A's policies and practices are around this. let's just say that the Office of the IACUC still wants to do some sort of congruency review. They want to do some sort of check on this to understand the work that is being done over at that other institution. So maybe we'll just say A here, but I wouldn't look at it askance if this came in and it said not applicable instead of yes. And then, the parties acknowledge that, in this case, institution B is going to do that core kind of check, and then monitoring on their property. Again, it's up to institution A whether you would click NA or if you would click yes. I think if you're doing a specific project by project one, you might want to be more specific to what's happening or what your expectations are related to that specific project. Whereas if you're doing a broad MOU that's covering a lot of activities, you might just click yes and for both institutions on that one. And then, notification directly to OLAW. In this case, since institution A is not handling any vertebrate animals, I would probably recommend that you just have institution B do a direct report and that it's not applicable for institution A. And then, this one should probably also say choose one A or B, but you would probably change this to institution B, and just make sure that they know that they are responsible for making those disclosures. And then we've also got institution B agrees to promptly notify institution A of any reportable events. So you would say yes. And then, if you're going to have that, because sometimes data and information is flowing both ways. And as I said earlier, if there is an animal welfare issue that occurs during the life of a grant, if one institution is not aware of that event that happened, it could change the amount of data that's going between the two institutions. It could change what that data means. Do you want to remove, if you had something happen halfway through a protocol, would you want to remove a certain amount of data because the protocol wasn't finished for a particular one individual or subgroup? You would want to, kind of know about that. So you might actually have this be yes for both institutions. In this case, institution A isn't handling any animals, so we'll say not applicable for them. And we'd probably then say not applicable for institution B as well, because they, in this case, are not doing the action. They're not providing the notification. They're the recipient of the notification. And then here, which institution is responsible for reporting USDA regulated animal activities? And again, I would assume that this would be institution B. Institution A would say no. And same for this one. And then I would route this to, somebody, the appropriate party at my institution for review, and likely the IACUC administrator, and they would review it and sign off on it. Anything else you want me to go through?
This is great, Amanda. Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you.
Sure.
We have a ton of questions in the chat and coming in through the Q&A box. So whenever you're ready to move on to those, just let us know.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, let's first, Nicolette, do you want to start sharing again for the question slides? We're first going to tackle some questions that we received in advance of the webinar. And while Nicolette is working on that, just bring up my version. Okay, so the first question is going to be for you, Amanda, and it's is using the MOU sample mandatory? The guide only states that a formal written understanding is required and should be used.
It is not mandatory. Institutions have and continue to continue to have latitude to choose the mechanism that is most appropriate for their business processes and procedures. So we really want to underline that and want to make sure that institutions understand that is totally okay. And OLAW is not prescribing it. Even FDP amongst its members is not prescribing that you need to use the MOU sample. We do in fact have members that use the subaward. We have members that might, use other methodologies. So we don't want to stop those, but we wanted to provide a tool or a resource that could help institutions start to get toward consistency that is helpful.
Awesome, thank you. All right, our next question is, what is the difference between an MOU and an interinstitutional assurance? And Axel, this one's for you.
Okay, thanks. So I just want to stress that the MOU is specifically to ensure animal welfare, and there's lots of other documents that come into play when institutions collaborate. And so that's the whole reason why FDP took on this project, because there is so much confusion and there's lots of different documents involved. But the MOU is recommended specifically in the guide for collaborating institutions to address the responsibilities for animal care and use and to avoid ambiguities. The IIA is the interinstitutional assurance, which is issued by OLAW to an awardee institution that does not have its own animal program and instead uses an assured institution to conduct the animal activities. And these documents do not substitute for one another. And they don't, you can't use one instead of the other. It's just, they're totally different. One is to ensure animal welfare, and the other one is a legal requirement if you're getting funding from any of the agencies I mentioned, but your institution does not have an animal program, but you're getting the funding and you're performing the work at another institution that does have an animal program, and that's where the IIA comes into play.
Thanks. And there's a follow-up question for that. How does an MOU and an interinstitutional assurance relate to an institution's assurance?
Okay, so the MOU is independent of any assurance. The IIA is a type of assurance. It's an interinstitutional assurance, like I said, for an institution that does not have its own animal program, but depends on another performance site with an animal assurance that has been issued by OLAW.
Great. All right. We do have a ton of questions that are coming in both through the Q&A box and through the chat box. Our speakers have a hard stop today at 2 o'clock, so we're not going to be able to get to all of these, but I promise you that we will ask them to answer these offline, and then we'll append these to the transcript. So in the chat box, you're going to see a link to our listserv. Please subscribe to that, and then we'll send out a notification when the transcript and the slides and the webinar recording come out. But we'll go until 2 o'clock with some of the questions that are received, and keep entering them in the chat box or the Q&A box as they come up. Okay, so the first question that we have is this template intended to be used as a component of or attached to the FDP subaward template or separately? You want to take this one, Amanda?
Sure. I would recommend that it be used separately. I would guess if you're using the MOU sample, a lot of the information that's there isn't necessarily relevant to the other parts of the collaboration, or it might not get over to the Office of the IACUC. So I'd probably handle them separately, but if you wanted to incorporate them and that's what both parties wanted to do, I would say go for it. I think it's totally fine.
Okay. The next one, let's see, it was a little bit unclear to me, but I'll read it anyways. All right, when a grant recipient has a subaward to a collaborating institution for all the live animal work in the grant, the IACUC at the recipient institution may not be aware that an MOU is needed, not aware of the grant, in other words. The FDP subaward template language that includes reliance language has helped bridge this gap. Will the MOU be linked to that template so the grant recipient and collaborating institution can complete the MOU, or at least trigger a discussion if one is desired?
I think if I'm understanding the question is kind of what is the difference between those two documents and how do we relate them to each other? The way that the subaward language is currently written is it documents, is there vertebrate animal work being performed by the subrecipient under the project, and then is that properly approved by the subrecipient institution, and build in accordance with the dates of the appropriate applicable approvals. In other words, when it is an allowable cost. That is what the language in the FDP subaward is intended to cover. The language in the MOU itself is intended to cover questions about the care and use of the animals themselves, including those issues that we talked about, like transportation, ownership, oversight, etc. And so that they are kind of two very different areas. We did not put like a direct link from one over to the other, just because of the fact that there are a lot of institutions where those are very separated work streams, and we weren't really at a point when we started this process to tie those work streams together in any way for our membership. It's an open question as to whether, now that we have this document, if the subaward subcommittee will take another look at the language and incorporate more MOU things now that we've kind of defined what needs to be defined in an MOU, or if those things are just so different that we want to keep those things separated to the maximum extent possible, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. And if that didn't answer the question, if the questioner wants to put something else in the chat box, go ahead, and then we'll talk with Amanda again offline and get back to you. All right, the next question. Is the intention to use the template for collaborations with U.S. entities only? How can the MOU be adapted for use with foreign collaborators?
Great question.
It would be the same. I mean, it really doesn't matter, because the MOU specifically only addresses animal issues. So if the domestic entity is dealing with animals in a foreign site, it would pretty much be the same information, although, again, you can adapt it to your own needs. It wouldn't necessarily have all of the boxes that are applicable here, but as far as who's responsible for animal care, who's responsible for reporting problems, those items would be the same, regardless of whether it's domestic or foreign. Amanda, please jump in.
No, I think that that's absolutely true, Axel, and you're spot on. When we wrote this, though, we did write this to be used between two OLAW assured institutions. So if your foreign collaborator does not have an OLAW assurance, you might want to think about, making some changes or looking into that further. But if they have an OLAW assurance, which they do not have to be a domestic entity to have an OLAW assurance, then this is absolutely an appropriate document, because it's not going into the rules of a specific animal care and use as governed by any one specific, government. It's just what's applicable under your OLAW assurance.
And just to add, somebody asked about a foreign assurance. Yes, of course, if PHS funds are being used abroad, a foreign assurance is needed. Again, that's separate from the MOU. If your institution is subject to the guide, that's when you'll be using the MOU. If you're subject to the PHS policy, then a foreign assurance is needed, yes.
I think we have time for one more question. There's a great question in the chat that or in the Q&A that I can see. Would it be acceptable to update the MOU title to agreement, as are possibly others as well? Institution is very specific about using the word MOU for very particular cases, with the understanding that FDP will be removed as Amanda has requested. I think that that's okay. I think you have to understand, though, that on the other side of that, other institutions may say, well, it says the word agreement, that implies something different than an MOU to our institution. It might have to go through a different legal channel at the recipient institution. So know that changing those words might have an impact on how the other institution receives that document. Axel, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to that?
No, that's perfectly fine.
Thanks, everyone. This is Nicolette. We are up at 2. We just want to tell you about the next webinar with a topic to be determined in spring of 2023. And thank you all, and we'll see you at the next one. And as Kate mentioned, we will be appending answers to the questions we weren't able to answer live on the webinar transcript. Thanks so much for coming.